The morning sun cast golden rays across the sprawling gardens of Windsor Castle as Prince Harry adjusted his navy blue suit jacket for the third time. His palms were slightly damp with nervous sweat, though he tried to hide it from the bustling team of event coordinators rushing around him. Today was no ordinary day. It was the grand opening ceremony for the new Children's Wildlife Sanctuary, a project that had been close to his heart for over 2 years. "Your Royal Highness, we're ready for you in 5 minutes," announced Sarah, the head of public relations, her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. She had been working with Harry for months to perfect every detail of this event, from the guest list to the carefully crafted speech that now sat folded in his jacket pocket. Harry nodded and took a deep breath, looking out at the gathering crowd beyond the garden gates. Nearly 300 people had assembled for this special occasion. Families with children, wildlife conservationists, local dignitaries, and members of the press. The new sanctuary represented months of planning, fundraising, and construction, all aimed at creating a safe haven where children could learn about British wildlife while helping injured animals recover. The idea had come to him during a particularly difficult period in his life. After stepping back from his senior royal duties, Harry had been searching for meaningful ways to continue his charitable work. During a visit to a small wildlife rescue center in Surrey, he had watched a group of school children tenderly care for an injured hedgehog. Their pure joy and natural compassion had moved him deeply, sparking the vision for this much larger project. "The children will learn responsibility," he had explained to the Board of Trustees during one of their early meetings. "They'll understand that even the smallest creatures deserve our protection and care. It's about building empathy and connection with the natural world." Now, as he walked toward the small wooden podium set up near the sanctuary's main entrance, Harry felt a familiar mix of excitement and nervousness. Public speaking had never been his favorite aspect of royal duties, but this was different. This was personal. The sanctuary represented hope, healing, and the belief that young people could make a real difference in the world. The crowd quieted as he approached the microphone. Children sat cross-legged on blankets spread across the grass, their faces turned up toward him with curious expressions. Parents stood behind them, many holding cameras and phones to capture the moment. Local news crews had positioned their equipment strategically around the perimeter, their large lenses focused on the prince. "Good morning, everyone," Harry began, his voice carrying clearly across the garden. "Thank you all for being here today. What we're celebrating isn't just the opening of a building. We're celebrating the beginning of something truly special." He gestured toward the rustic wooden structure behind him, with its large windows and child-friendly design. Inside, the sanctuary housed rehabilitation areas for various British wildlife, from injured birds to orphaned fox cubs. Educational displays would teach visitors about local ecosystems, while hands-on activities would allow children to participate in actual animal care under expert supervision. 2 years ago, I met a little girl named Emma at a wildlife rescue center, Harry continued, his voice growing more confident. She was only 7 years old, but she was bottle-feeding an abandoned deer fawn with the kind of gentle care that many adults never learn. When I asked her why she wanted to help animals, she looked at me with the most serious expression and said, "Because they can't help themselves, can they?" A ripple of appreciative laughter moved through the crowd. Several parents exchanged knowing smiles, recognizing their own children's simple wisdom in Emma's words. "That moment changed everything for me," Harry admitted. "It reminded me that children have an instinctive understanding of kindness and responsibility. They don't see helping others, whether human or animal, as a burden or an obligation. They see it as the most natural thing in the world." As he spoke, Harry noticed movement in his peripheral vision. The sanctuary's gardens were in full bloom, with lavender bushes, wildflower patches, and herb gardens specifically planted to attract beneficial insects. Bees buzzed lazily from flower to flower, their important work of pollination continuing undisturbed by the human ceremony taking place nearby. The Children's Wildlife Sanctuary will give young people the chance to act on that natural compassion, Harry explained. They'll learn practical skills, how to build birdhouses, how to create butterfly gardens, how to recognize signs of illness in wildlife. But more importantly, they'll learn that their actions matter, that they have the power to make life better for creatures who cannot speak for themselves. The prince pulled his prepared speech from his pocket, though he found himself speaking more from the heart than from his notes. The morning was perfect for an outdoor event, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze that carried the sweet scent of honeysuckle and roses through the air. We've designed this sanctuary to be a place of learning, healing, and hope, he continued. Children will work alongside experienced wildlife rehabilitators, veterinarians, and conservationists. They'll see firsthand how small actions can have big impacts. A properly built nest box might save an entire family of birds. A thoughtfully planted garden might provide crucial habitat for endangered butterflies. Harry paused to take a sip of water from the glass that had been placed on the podium. The crowd remained attentive, with many people nodding in agreement with his words. He could see genuine enthusiasm in the faces before him. This wasn't just polite royal protocol, but real engagement with the project's mission. But this sanctuary isn't just about teaching children to care for animals, Harry said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. It's about teaching them to care for each other and for the world they're inheriting. When a child learns to be gentle with a frightened rabbit, they're also learning empathy. When they understand the complex relationships in an ecosystem, they're learning that we're all connected. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the gathering crowd and bringing more activity to the garden around them. Butterflies danced among the flowers, birds chirped from the oak trees that shaded parts of the lawn, and somewhere nearby, a family of bees had discovered a particularly attractive patch of clover. Harry felt his confidence growing as he continued his speech, knowing that every word came from genuine belief in the project's importance. This wasn't just another ribbon-cutting ceremony. It was the beginning of something that could touch hundreds of young lives each year. The gentle breeze that had been refreshing the crowd all morning began to pick up slightly, rustling the leaves of the ancient oak trees that surrounded the sanctuary grounds. Harry loosened his shoulders, feeling more relaxed as he moved into the heart of his speech. The faces in the crowd showed genuine interest, and several children had moved closer to the podium, clearly captivated by his words. "I want to share another story with you," Harry said, his voice warm with memory. "Last month, during one of our final preparation days, a group of local school children came to visit the sanctuary. We weren't quite finished with construction yet. There were still tools scattered around, paint cans in corners, and workers putting finishing touches on the animal enclosures." He smiled at the recollection, remembering how the children's excitement had been infectious despite the construction chaos around them. One little boy, maybe 8 years old, spotted a bird that had somehow gotten trapped inside the main building. It was a small robin, probably confused by all the construction noise and activity. While all the adults were standing around discussing the best way to help the bird get back outside, this boy simply opened one of the large windows and stood very still. The crowd leaned in slightly, curious about the outcome of the story. Within minutes, that robin flew right out the window to freedom. The boy turned to me and said, "Sometimes the simple way is the best way, isn't it?" And he was absolutely right. Children often see solutions that we adults miss because we make things too complicated. A warm chuckle rippled through the audience. Many of the parents were nodding, recognizing similar moments of childhood wisdom in their own experiences. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we want to encourage here," Harry continued. "We want children to trust their instincts, to believe in their ability to help, and to understand that you don't need to be an expert to make a difference. Sometimes you just need to open a window." As he spoke, Harry noticed that the bee activity around the garden had increased considerably. The warming morning sun was bringing more pollinators to the carefully planned flower beds. Dozens of bees moved busily from bloom to bloom, their gentle humming creating a pleasant background soundtrack to the ceremony. "The sanctuary will offer programs for children of all ages," Harry explained, pulling his speech back to the practical details. "Younger children will start with basic animal care, feeding time, cleaning habitats, and learning to observe animal behavior. They'll discover that a quiet approach often works better than an excited one, and that patience is one of the most important tools in wildlife care. He gestured toward the building behind him, where large windows offered glimpses of the spacious, well-lit interior spaces designed specifically for both animal comfort and educational activities. Older children will take on more complex responsibilities. They might help with medical treatments under supervision, assist with animal releases back into the wild, or even participate in research projects that help us better understand local wildlife populations. The prince paused to adjust the microphone, which had been positioned perfectly at the beginning of his speech, but now seemed slightly too low as his enthusiasm caused him to stand taller and gesture more expressively. But perhaps most importantly, he continued, children will learn that conservation isn't just about dramatic rescues or exotic animals in far-off places. Real conservation happens in our own backyards, with the creatures we share our daily lives with, the hedgehogs in our gardens, the birds at our bird feeders, the bees that pollinate our flowers. As if summoned by his words, a particularly large and industrious bee chose that moment to investigate the small bouquet of local wildflowers that had been placed on the podium as decoration. The bee landed on a stem of lavender just inches from Harry's left hand, its wings catching the morning sunlight as it worked. Harry noticed the bee, but continued speaking without interruption, having grown comfortable with nature's presence during his many outdoor events and military service. The bee seemed content to focus on its work while he focused on his. We've partnered with local schools, youth organizations, and scouting groups to ensure that children from all backgrounds have access to these programs, Harry explained. No child should be excluded from the chance to connect with nature because of financial circumstances or transportation barriers. We've arranged for school bus transportation and have made all programs completely free of charge. Several adults in the crowd nodded appreciatively at this information. Making programs accessible regardless of economic background had been one of Harry's strongest requirements during the planning phase, remembering his own privileged childhood and wanting to ensure that opportunity wasn't determined by family wealth. The sanctuary's educational approach is hands-on and practical, he continued. Children won't just read about animal behavior. They'll observe it firsthand. They won't just learn about habitat requirements. They'll help build and maintain actual habitats. They won't just study conservation theory. They'll practice conservation every single day. The bee on the podium had been joined by two others, all working peacefully among the flowers while completely ignoring the large gathering of humans nearby. Their presence seemed to emphasize Harry's point about coexisting harmoniously with wildlife. We believe that children learn best when they feel trusted with real responsibilities, Harry said, his voice growing more passionate. That's why sanctuary participants won't just be observers. They'll be active partners in the care and rehabilitation of animals. Of course, everything will be supervised by trained professionals, but the children's contributions will be genuine and meaningful. He took another sip of water, noticing that the morning was growing warmer. The crowd seemed comfortable, with many people having shed light jackets or sweaters as the sun climbed higher in the clear blue sky. I've had the privilege of visiting many charitable organizations around the world, Harry reflected. I've seen incredible work being done by dedicated people in challenging circumstances. But I've also noticed something interesting. The most successful programs are always the ones that give people, especially young people, a real sense of ownership and responsibility. The prince's voice carried clearly across the garden, reaching even the families seated on blankets at the back of the gathering. Children who had been fidgeting earlier now sat quietly, many with their hands raised to shield their eyes from the increasingly bright sun. When children feel that their work matters, when they see direct results from their efforts, something magical happens. They don't just learn skills. They discover their own capacity for making positive change. They realize that they don't have to wait until they're adults to make a difference in the world. As Harry spoke these words, one of the bees that had been peacefully working among the podium flowers decided to explore beyond the bouquet. With the casual confidence of a creature that had never learned to fear humans, The bee began a lazy, meandering flight path that took it in gentle circles around the speaking area. The curious bee continued its exploration around the podium area, apparently fascinated by something it had detected. Perhaps it was drawn to the scent of Harry's aftershave, or maybe the subtle floral notes in the fabric softener used on his shirt. Whatever the attraction, the bee seemed determined to investigate further. Harry, focused intently on his speech and the responsive crowd before him, remained unaware of his new flying companion. He had moved into what he considered the most important part of his presentation, the personal impact he hoped the sanctuary would have on each participating child. "I remember my own childhood experiences with animals," he said, his voice taking on a more intimate tone. "My brother and I were fortunate enough to grow up surrounded by dogs, horses, and access to incredible natural spaces. But some of my most meaningful lessons didn't come from grand adventures or formal instruction. They came from quiet moments of simply observing and caring for creatures that needed help." The crowd remained attentive, though several people in the front rows had begun to notice the bee's increasingly bold investigation of the speaking area. A few children pointed excitedly at the insect, whispering to their parents about the bee visiting the prince. "One summer when I was about 10 years old," Harry continued, "I found an injured bird in the garden at Highgrove. It was just a common blackbird with a damaged wing, nothing exotic or particularly special. But caring for that bird, checking on it every morning, making sure it had fresh water, watching it gradually heal and return to full strength, taught me lessons about patience, responsibility, and the satisfaction of helping another living being that no textbook could have provided." The bee had now begun what appeared to be a systematic exploration of the podium itself, landing briefly on the microphone stand, investigating the water glass, and showing particular interest in the small stack of backup notes Harry had placed beside his prepared speech. "That's the kind of experience we want to provide here," Harry explained, gesturing toward the sanctuary building. "Not dramatic, headline-grabbing moments, but quiet, meaningful connections that shape how children see themselves in relationship to the natural world around them." Several members of the audience were now openly watching the bee's movements with amused interest. The insect seemed completely unbothered by the large crowd or the formal nature of the occasion, treating the ceremony as simply another part of its daily work environment. "The children who participate in our programs will return home with more than just knowledge about animals," Harry continued, his passion for the project evident in every word. "They'll return with confidence in their ability to make positive changes, with empathy that extends beyond their own species, and with a deep understanding that every creature, no matter how small, has value and deserves our consideration." The bee, having completed its investigation of the inanimate objects around the podium, began to show interest in Harry himself. It flew a slow, deliberate circle around his head, as if trying to determine whether this tall, animated human might also be worth investigating. "We've designed our programs to grow with the children," Harry explained, still focused entirely on his speech. "A child who starts here at age 6 feeding baby rabbits might return as a teenager to assist with more complex medical procedures. A young person who begins by learning to identify different bird calls might eventually participate in actual wildlife research that contributes to scientific understanding." The bee had apparently reached a decision about Harry's potential as an object of interest. With the direct approach typical of its species, it began to hover closer to the prince, investigating the collar of his jacket and the area around his neck where traces of his morning cologne lingered. "But perhaps most importantly," Harry said, his voice rising slightly with enthusiasm, "we want children to understand that conservation and wildlife protection aren't burdens or obligations imposed by adults. They're opportunities for young people to express their natural compassion and to see immediate, tangible results from their efforts." Several audience members were now exchanging glances and quiet comments about the bee's bold behavior. A few people had begun to pull out their phones, sensing that something amusing might be about to happen, though they weren't quite sure what. When a child successfully nurses an injured animal back to health and watches it return to the wild, Harry continued, They experience something that no amount of classroom instruction can provide, the direct knowledge that their actions have real, positive consequences in the world. The bee had now zeroed in on something that had captured its complete attention. A small area just behind Harry's left ear where a trace of sweet scent seemed to linger. Perhaps it was his shampoo, or maybe just the natural scent of his skin warmed by the morning sun and nervous perspiration. This is why hands-on experience is so crucial, Harry emphasized, raising his left hand in a gesture that brought it very close to where the bee was conducting its investigation. Children need to feel the weight of real responsibility, to see that adults trust them with important tasks, and to understand that their contribution makes a genuine difference. The bee, apparently having located exactly what it had been searching for, decided to land. With the casual confidence of a creature that had never learned to distinguish between flowers and human beings as appropriate landing sites, it settled gently on the skin just behind Harry's left ear. Harry continued speaking, still completely unaware of his new passenger. The bee seemed content to rest there, having found whatever scent had attracted its attention. It sat quietly, its legs gripping Harry's skin gently, its wings folded peacefully against its body. "The sanctuary represents our faith in young people," Harry declared, his voice carrying clearly across the now very attentive crowd. "We believe that children, given the opportunity and proper guidance, will choose kindness over indifference, responsibility over carelessness, and action over apathy." In the front row, a little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered urgently, "Mummy, there's a bee on the prince." Her voice, though intended to be quiet, carried clearly in the still morning air. Harry paused mid-sentence, a look of confusion crossing his face. He had heard the child's words, but wasn't quite sure he had understood them correctly. "I'm sorry, what was that?" he asked with a slight smile, looking toward the little girl who had spoken. The little girl, suddenly, finding herself the center of attention from both the prince and the entire crowd, became shy and buried her face against her mother's shoulder. But her mother, smiling broadly, spoke up clearly. "She said there's a bee on you, Your Royal Highness." Harry's eyebrows raised in surprise, and he instinctively started to reach toward his neck. "A bee? Where exactly?" he began, but stopped mid-motion as he felt a tiny tickling sensation behind his left ear. The realization that he was indeed sharing his personal space with an insect caused him to freeze momentarily, his hand suspended halfway to his neck. "Oh," he said, his voice taking on a slightly higher pitch. "There really is a bee on me, isn't there?" The crowd erupted in delighted laughter. After the formal tone of the ceremony, this unexpected moment of natural comedy was exactly the kind of humanizing incident that people loved. Camera phones appeared instantly, with dozens of people trying to capture the surreal image of Prince Harry conducting a serious speech while hosting an uninvited flying guest. "Well," Harry said, trying to maintain his composure while being acutely aware of the tiny creature perched just behind his ear, "I suppose this is a perfect demonstration of human-wildlife coexistence in action." More laughter rippled through the crowd. Several children had now stood up on their blankets to get a better view of the spectacle, clearly finding this development far more interesting than any formal speech about animal conservation. Harry remained very still, unsure of the best way to handle the situation. His military training had prepared him for many unexpected scenarios, but bee management during public speaking had not been covered in any of his courses. The insect seemed perfectly content in its current location, showing no signs of wanting to move on. "I'm told that bees are generally quite peaceful unless they feel threatened," Harry said, attempting to continue his speech while dealing with the unusual circumstances. "So I think the best approach might be to just carry on and hope our little friend here decides to move along when it's ready." The bee, as if responding to being mentioned, shifted slightly, but made no move to leave its chosen perch. This small movement caused Harry to tense up visibly, which only added to the crowd's amusement. "Actually," Harry said, his voice now clearly betraying his nervousness despite his attempts to remain composed, "I have to admit that I'm not entirely sure what the protocol is for this situation." Do I continue with my speech? Do I try to encourage our buzzing friend to relocate? Do I pretend this isn't happening? A voice from the crowd called out, "Just keep talking. This is brilliant." This was followed by more laughter and encouraging calls from various audience members who were thoroughly enjoying this unscripted entertainment. Right then, Harry said, taking a deep breath and trying to settle back into his speech rhythm despite the very distracting presence near his ear. Where was I? Oh yes, the importance of hands-on learning experiences for children. He paused, clearly struggling to remember his train of thought while being hyper-aware of every tiny movement of the bee. The insect chose that moment to readjust its position slightly, causing Harry to wince and unconsciously lean his head away from where the bee was sitting. "You know," Harry said, abandoning his prepared remarks entirely, "this is actually turning into quite an educational moment itself. Here we have a perfect example of how wildlife doesn't always respect our human schedules and plans." The crowd was now fully engaged in a way that no formal speech could have achieved. Children were giggling, adults were grinning broadly, and even the usually serious-faced security personnel were struggling to suppress their amusement. "I'm trying very hard to remember everything I've learned about bee behavior," Harry continued, speaking more slowly and carefully than before. "I know they're not naturally aggressive. I know they're more interested in flowers than in people. I know they play a crucial role in our ecosystem." The bee shifted again, this time moving slightly lower down Harry's neck. This new position was apparently less comfortable for the insect, because it began to move around more actively, walking in small circles on Harry's skin as if looking for a better spot. "Oh, that's quite ticklish, actually," Harry said, his voice rising slightly as he tried not to react too strongly to the sensation. "This is definitely not covered in any Royal Protocol handbook I've ever read." The audience was now openly laughing, with many people applauding this unexpected turn of events. Several parents were pointing out to their children how calm and gentle the prince was being with the bee, turning the moment into an impromptu lesson about respecting wildlife. "I suppose," Harry said, speaking through clenched teeth as the bee continued its exploration of his neck area, "this demonstrates one of the key principles we want children to learn here at the sanctuary, that sometimes the best thing to do when encountering wildlife is simply to be patient and let them make their own decisions about what they want to do." The bee seemed to be becoming more active rather than less, apparently having decided that Harry's neck area required thorough investigation. It was now walking in larger circles, occasionally pausing to probe at interesting scents or textures. "Although," Harry added, his voice becoming slightly strained, "I have to say that patience is somewhat easier in theory than in practice when you're the one being explored." A woman in the crowd called out, "Maybe it likes your aftershave." This suggestion prompted more laughter, and several other shouted comments about possible reasons for the bee's interest in the prince. "That's entirely possible," Harry replied, grateful for any opportunity to engage with the audience while he waited for his uninvited guest to decide to move on. "I may have to reconsider my choice of grooming products for future outdoor events." The bee had now moved to the side of Harry's neck, where it was partially visible to the audience. This allowed everyone to see clearly that it was indeed a substantial honeybee, and that it seemed completely comfortable and unhurried in its investigation of the prince. "I'm beginning to think," Harry said, his voice taking on a note of resigned amusement, "that our friend here has decided I make an acceptable temporary flower substitute. Either that, or it's conducting some sort of quality inspection of my suitability as a sanctuary spokesperson." Just as the laughter from this comment began to die down, the bee made a decision that changed everything. Instead of continuing its leisurely exploration or flying away as everyone expected, it moved to a new position on Harry's neck and then, apparently finding the spot particularly interesting, decided to investigate further with its stinger. The sharp, sudden pain that shot through Harry's neck was completely unexpected. Would have been a mildly ticklish and amusing situation instantly transformed into something much more uncomfortable. The bee, apparently feeling threatened by some movement or change in Harry's scent, had decided to defend itself in the most direct way possible. "Ow!" Harry exclaimed, his composed royal demeanor completely forgotten as he instinctively slapped his hand to his neck. "Ouch, that bee!" The crowd's laughter doubled in volume at this completely natural, unguarded reaction from the prince. Here was a moment of pure, relatable humanity. Anyone who had ever been stung by a bee could instantly sympathize with Harry's surprise and discomfort. "Oh, that smarts quite a bit, actually," Harry said, rubbing his neck where the bee had left its stinger. His face showed a mixture of pain, embarrassment, and rueful amusement at the absurdity of the situation. The bee, having delivered its sting and lost its stinger in the process, buzzed weakly around the podium area for a few moments before settling on one of the flowers in the decorative bouquet. Its mission accomplished, it seemed content to return to more traditional bee activities. "Well," Harry said, still rubbing his neck and trying to regain his composure, "I think it's safe to say that our friend there has definitely made its feelings known about my invasion of its garden space." The crowd was now in a state of delighted uproar. This was exactly the kind of unscripted, genuine moment that people would remember and talk about for years. The formal opening ceremony had become a comedy show, and everyone was thoroughly enjoying the unexpected entertainment. "I have to say," Harry continued, his voice still slightly strained from the sting, but his sense of humor clearly intact, "this is not quite how I imagined this speech going when I was practicing it this morning. Though I suppose it does provide a very practical demonstration of why we need to respect wildlife and understand that we're sharing space with creatures who have their own agendas." A man in the crowd shouted, "Are you allergic to bee stings, Your Highness?" This question prompted a moment of more serious concern, as several people in the audience suddenly realized that a bee sting could potentially be dangerous for someone with allergies. "No, thankfully I'm not allergic," Harry replied, touching his neck gingerly. "Though I think I'm going to have quite an interesting story to tell about today's events. I imagine the headlines tomorrow will be quite creative." This comment prompted more laughter as people began to imagine the various ways the media would describe the incident. Prince stung by duty, royal pain in the neck, and Harry's buzzworthy speech were just a few of the puns that would undoubtedly appear in newspapers the following day. "You know," Harry said, clearly deciding to embrace the situation rather than fight it, "in some ways this is perfect. We're here to celebrate a place where children will learn to coexist with wildlife, and we've just had a very real demonstration of how that relationship sometimes involves unexpected challenges." He looked down at the sting site on his neck, which was already beginning to show a small red mark. The bee was just doing what bees do, protecting itself when it felt threatened. "I apparently did something that made it nervous, and it responded according to its instincts." Several parents in the audience nodded appreciatively at this interpretation. Instead of getting angry at the bee or treating it as a villain, Harry was using the incident as a teaching moment, exactly the kind of approach they hoped their children would learn at the sanctuary. "This is actually a valuable lesson for everyone here," Harry continued, warming to this new direction for his speech. "When we interact with wildlife, we have to remember that we're entering their world, not the other way around. Sometimes it means accepting that things won't go according to our human plans." The crowd had settled into attentive listening again, though there were still occasional chuckles and comments about the dramatic turn the ceremony had taken. "Children who participate in our programs will undoubtedly have their own unexpected encounters with animals," Harry explained. "Maybe not be stings during formal speeches, but certainly moments when animals don't behave exactly as expected or wanted." He gestured toward the sanctuary building, his enthusiasm for the project clearly undimmed by his recent stinging experience. Learning to handle those situations with patience, understanding, and respect for the animal's perspective, that's one of the most important skills we can teach young people. Not just for working with wildlife, but for dealing with any situation where things don't go according to plan. A little boy in the front row raised his hand and called out, "Does it still hurt?" His innocent concern prompted warm smiles throughout the crowd. "It does still sting a bit," Harry admitted honestly, "but it's getting better already. Bee stings look dramatic when they happen, but they're usually not too serious unless someone is allergic." He turned toward the sanctuary building, clearly ready to wrap up his speech despite its unconventional development. I think our buzzing friend here has actually provided the perfect introduction to what this sanctuary is all about, Harry concluded. Real experiences with real animals, unexpected challenges that teach us patience and respect, and the understanding that sharing our world with wildlife means accepting that they have just as much right to be here as we do. The crowd erupted in enthusiastic applause, clearly appreciating both Harry's handling of the unusual situation and his ability to turn an embarrassing moment into a meaningful lesson. "So," Harry said with a grin, rubbing his neck one more time, "let me officially welcome you all to the Children's Wildlife Sanctuary, where we promise that every visit will be educational, though probably not quite as memorable as today's opening ceremony." As the laughter and applause died down, Harry stepped away from the podium to participate in the ribbon-cutting ceremony that would officially open the sanctuary. The bee that had provided such unexpected entertainment continued working peacefully among the flowers, apparently satisfied that it had made its point about territorial boundaries. The rest of the opening ceremony proceeded smoothly, but everyone knew that the bee sting moment would be the part of the day that people remembered and retold. It had transformed a formal royal event into something genuinely human and memorable, and provided exactly the kind of authentic connection between people and wildlife that the sanctuary hoped to foster in every child who would participate in its programs.